When Rome shattered Queen Zenobia's forces outside Antioch in 272 CE, her commanders braced for a swift execution. That was Rome's mercy. What followed was slower, deliberate, and far more terrifying. The empire did not simply kill defeated queens, it dismantled them. Rome had mastered a punishment worse than death, turning captured rulers into walking symbols of total domination. For a woman who wore a crown, defeat was not the end of power. It was the beginning of calculated humiliation meant to strip away identity, authority, and dignity in front of the entire world. Roman law gave no protection to defeated queens. Long before the legions displayed their captives in triumphal parades, the law of Rome had already sealed the fate of every defeated ruler. In the eyes of the Roman legal world, conquest erased identity. There was no shield for foreign queens once their banners fell and their armies broke. Rome's legal codes placed war captives in the same category as property taken in battle, not as persons with rights, but as objects to be disposed of at a victor's will. Central to this system was the principle known as ius gentium, or the law of nations. This was not a code of mercy. It was a framework that defined how Rome dealt with all foreigners and enemies. Under ius gentium, the moment a city surrendered or a force was defeated, every member of that people, common soldier or crowned monarch, ceased to have legal standing separate from their captors. They became property. Freeborn status, royal birthright, or past power meant nothing once Rome's victory was secured. Roman citizens lived under a very different legal shield. A Roman citizen could not be flogged without scandal. Executing one without trial would ignite outrage back home. But these protections were exclusive. They applied only within the walls of the city and to those entitled to Roman law. Queens from outside that system had no such safeguard. They were not Roman. Their bodies, their freedom, their fate lay entirely in the hands of those who had conquered them. The earliest codification of these principles appeared in the 12 Tables, a set of laws dating back to the first centuries of Rome's Republic. These laws were meant to provide structure to Roman society, defining rights and punishments for Romans themselves. But the same legal tradition made no effort to grant similar dignity to those taken in war. In practice, this meant that defeat dissolved all former status. Queens who had once directed armies and negotiated treaties found that their crowns offered no protection once they were bound in chains. Roman military culture reinforced this legal reality with brutal efficiency. A captive was valuable only insofar as they could be displayed, sold, or exploited. Some elite prisoners might be kept in relative comfort for ransom or political leverage, but most were subject to immediate degradation. The distinction between prisoner and slave existed only on paper. In the world of conquest on the ground, that line vanished the instant a queen was handed over to her captors. Accounts from ancient historians confirm this harsh reality. Officials and soldiers showed no hesitation in violating defeated royalty because by law, those women were no longer sovereigns. They were possessions of the state or of the men who had captured them. Rome's legal structures had stripped away every right, every privilege, and every claim to dignity once their armies fell. The result was a world in which the most powerful queens on earth could be reduced by law to the status of spoils of war. What exactly was a Roman triumph? Before you can understand what happened to the queens who were not spared, you have to understand what a Roman triumph truly was. Not the polished version shown in films, not a victory parade filled with smiles and cheering crowds. The real triumph was something darker. It was a weapon, a carefully designed act of psychological warfare, disguised as celebration. When a Roman general crushed a major enemy, the Senate could grant him a triumph, the highest honor Rome could offer. This was not routine. It was rare, political, and deeply symbolic. On the surface, it looked like a citywide festival. In reality, it was Rome teaching the world a lesson about power. The procession began outside the city, at the Field of Mars, and wound through the heart of Rome for nearly 4 kilometers. It ended at the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, the most sacred space in the empire. On that day, Rome stopped functioning. Shops closed, courts adjourned, work ceased. Even enslaved people were allowed to line the streets, watching others like themselves march toward permanent bondage. Imagine experiencing this not as a spectator, but as a captured queen. You would hear the procession long before you saw it. Trumpets and drums echoing off stone walls. The sound rolling through the streets for nearly an hour. Then came the carts, wagon after wagon piled with the wealth of your defeated kingdom. Gold coins stamped with the faces of your ancestors. Silver vessels taken from your family halls. Sacred objects stripped from temples your people built over generations. The crowd cheered each cart, calculating what Roman taxes might now decrease because your riches belonged to them. Next came the images. Massive painted boards carried by enslaved men showing your cities burning, your soldiers cut down, your palace ransacked. Roman artists traveled with the legions for this purpose alone. The crowd laughed when they recognized your homeland in flames. Your destruction had become entertainment. Then came the animals. Exotic creatures taken from your land, lions in cages, elephants in chains, rare birds trapped in gilded frames. Proof that Rome had conquered not only your people but the soil beneath their feet. And then the noise faded. The drums slowed. The crowd fell quiet. This was the moment they were waiting for. First came the ordinary soldiers, chained together, heads lowered. They were already dead to the world, bound for slave markets. The crowd barely noticed them. All eyes were fixed ahead. Then you appeared. Captured rulers were forced to walk at the front of the prisoners, still wearing royal clothing, still adorned with crowns and jewels. This was intentional. A broken peasant meant nothing. A queen visibly defeated, still recognizable, shuffling in chains through hostile streets, delivered Rome's message clearly. No crown protects you. No army saves you. No throne is beyond reach. What the stories rarely show is what followed. Some captives survived the day. They were exiled, quietly imprisoned, or absorbed into Roman society. Others were taken underground into a prison beneath the city and never seen again. You would not know which fate awaited you until the final steps of that long walk. That uncertainty was not an accident. It was part of the punishment. Captured royal leaders shown in public victory parades. When Rome's armies returned from a hard-fought campaign, they did not enter the city quietly. Victory was not a whisper. It was a deliberate, sprawling spectacle designed to announce domination to every man, woman, and child within the city walls. This was the Roman triumph, a public parade that turned soldiers, spoils, and defeated rulers into instruments of state power. In the world of ancient Rome, a triumph was more than a celebration. It was a ritual of conquest, approved only by the Senate and meant to broadcast the empire's reach. When a general was granted this honor, a slow procession began long before dawn in the open plains of the Field of Mars, outside the city gates. From there, the parade snaked its way through the heart of Rome, along the honored Sacred Way, through the Forum, the city's political and social center, and up the Capitoline Hill to the great temple of Jupiter. This route, measured at nearly 2.5 miles from start to finish, was packed with viewers who lined the streets to stare at the procession. It was carefully organized to maximize psychological impact. First came the generals and magistrates who had sanctioned the war. Then musicians, dancers, and carts crowded with stolen treasures, exotic animals, artwork, and trophies that spoke of Rome's conquest of distant lands. But at the core of the spectacle were the prisoners of war. Battered soldiers and captured leaders were marched in chains, walking as proof of Rome's supremacy. When royalty was among the captives, their garments, once symbols of command and dignity, were often left intact. The effect was chilling. These figures, who had once ruled kingdoms and wielded swords, now trudged behind carts of loot, powerless and exposed before the cheering crowds. For a queen or prince, the triumph was a public crucible. Seen by thousands who crowded every inch of the Sacred Way, these rulers were displayed not as people, but as living trophies. The contrast was intentional. Rome wanted both its citizens and the wider world to understand that no throne was beyond reach, and that resistance to Rome would end in humiliation as much as defeat. The procession itself could last an entire day. Spectators did not merely pass by. They observed, pointed, mocked, and sometimes jeered at those once powerful enough to command armies. For many captives, the ordeal did not end with the parade. Some were later executed, others sold into slavery, and a few were kept alive as political pawns or curiosities, reminders of Rome's unchallenged ascendancy. Historians note that these triumphs were not only celebratory, but deeply propagandistic. They bound Rome's citizens together in shared pride and reinforced the idea that the empire's reach was absolute. In the glare of the crowd's acclaim, defeated royalty became living symbols of Rome's power, stripped of dignity, but never of spectacle. Zenobia, forced to walk through Rome in chains. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra was one of the few women in antiquity bold enough to rise against Rome, forging an empire that stretched across much of the East, from Syria into Egypt and deep into Anatolia. Her challenge to Roman rule was not a minor rebellion. It was a full-scale seizure of territory, a direct threat to the very idea of Roman supremacy in the 3rd century. Yet when Emperor Aurelian's legions finally routed her forces and captured her as she tried to flee across the Euphrates, her fate was not simply death on the battlefield. It became a public lesson in what happened to those who dared defy Rome. The ancient Roman celebration of military victory, the triumph, was already a deeply powerful ritual. Into this ceremony, Aurelian poured every treasure and every captive that symbolized his conquest of the East. Central among these was Zenobia herself. According to surviving accounts, she was brought to Rome under guard and prepared for a spectacle that would eclipse every triumph before it. The Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies from a later century, offers one of the most vivid descriptions of her appearance. In that telling, Zenobia was made to march in a parade so lavish that even her own ornaments weighed her down. She was draped not only in jewels that caught the light, but also in heavy chains of gold, shackles not just of restraint, but of symbolism. Her golden fetters were meant to show that the wealth she once ruled was now the very instrument of her bondage. To the crowds lining the streets of Rome, she was a living embodiment of conquered dignity. A queen who had once commanded armies now walked slowly past temples and markets, every step witnessed by thousands. The weight of her chains did more than restrict her movement. It reminded every spectator that Rome could reduce even the most powerful monarchs to subjugation. Ancient sources note that despite the burden of adornments and the hostile crowds, Zenobia maintained remarkable composure. Her calm under such scrutiny may have been the only thing that saved her life. Some historians suggest that Aurelian, aware that killing her outright would diminish the propaganda value of her humiliation, chose instead to spare her. After the triumph, he reportedly granted her a villa near Rome where she lived out her remaining years. Later writers even claimed she married into Roman society and that her daughters became part of Italy's elite. Whether this was mercy or another layer of calculated display is impossible to know definitively. What is clear from the surviving evidence is that her presence in Rome, once the seat of her enemy's power, became one of the most potent symbols of a defeated queen, turned perpetual reminder of imperial dominance. Boudica's daughters publicly hurt by Roman soldiers. In Roman Britain, the breaking point did not come on a battlefield. It came in public, under Roman law, and in front of witnesses who would never forget what they saw. When King Prasutagus of the Iceni died, he tried to shield his family from Roman cruelty. His will split his kingdom in half, naming the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside his 2 daughters. It was a desperate compromise meant to preserve peace and keep Roman officials satisfied. Instead, it gave Rome an excuse to take everything. Roman administrators ignored the will entirely. Iceni lands were seized, property was taken, noble households were stripped bare. The kingdom was declared Roman territory by force. When Queen Boudica protested this illegal seizure, Rome responded not with law but with punishment meant to humiliate and terrify. The ancient historian Tacitus records what followed, and his words are careful, restrained, and chilling. Boudica was beaten in public. This act alone carried enormous weight. Under Roman custom, even citizens were protected from such treatment without legal process. To strike a queen of an allied people was not discipline, it was a statement. But Rome went further. Boudica's daughters, still young and unmarried, were publicly harmed by Roman soldiers. Tacitus does not linger on details. He does not need to. His brief description makes clear that what happened crossed even Roman ideas of acceptable conduct. These were not acts of chaos or drunken cruelty. They were deliberate, ordered violations meant to destroy a ruling family in front of its people. This was violence as policy. Nothing about the punishment was hidden. The Iceni were meant to see it. By hurting the queen and her daughters openly, Roman officials sent a clear message. Resistance would not only fail, it would be punished through shame. Power would be taken not just from the body, but from honor, lineage, and memory. For Rome, this kind of public degradation served a purpose. It replaced loyalty with fear. It warned other tribes what awaited them if they questioned imperial control. The queen was not treated as a ruler. She was reduced to an example. But the plan collapsed. Instead of submission, the abuse ignited rage. Boudica did not retreat into silence. She rallied the Iceni and neighboring tribes, speaking not only as a leader, but as a mother whose children had been publicly harmed. Tacitus preserves a speech he attributes to her, where she declares that she fights not for a crown, but for justice after unbearable humiliation. The uprising that followed nearly shattered Roman Britain. 3 Roman cities were destroyed. Settlements burned. Roman civilians were killed in numbers that stunned imperial leadership. For a brief moment, Rome's grip on the island loosened. Eventually, discipline and formation defeated numbers. Roman forces regrouped and crushed the rebellion in a final battle whose exact location remains unknown. According to Tacitus, Boudica chose death over capture, taking poison rather than face Roman hands again. Her daughters disappear from history at that point. No record names their fate. No Roman inscription honors them. No account follows their lives. Their silence is itself evidence of the damage Rome inflicted. They vanish from the written world. Not because what happened was insignificant, but because empires rarely record the suffering they cause when it no longer serves power. In this episode, Rome revealed something essential about its rule. Law applied only to those inside the empire's protection. Outside it, even queens and children could be used as tools of fear. What was done to Boudica's family was not an accident of war. It was a calculated act meant to break a people by breaking their leaders first. What happened to rulers after the parades ended? For many defeated rulers, the triumph was not the end of their suffering. It was the final pause before death. As the victory parade climbed toward the Capitoline Hill, captives understood that the cheers around them masked something darker. While the general continued on to honor the gods, selected prisoners were quietly pulled aside and taken to a place every enemy of Rome feared: the Mamertine prison, known in Latin as the Tullianum. This stone structure sat beneath the city itself, carved into the slope of the hill like a buried wound. The prison was not large, but it was designed to erase hope. The upper chamber served as a temporary holding room. Below it was a deeper space, reachable only through a narrow opening in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered down into darkness, into air that barely moved, surrounded by damp stone and filth. This lower chamber was where Rome ended its enemies, out of sight, while celebrations echoed above. Execution here was not swift or merciful. Some captives were suffocated. Others were left without food or water until their bodies failed. The method was less important than the message. Rome wanted these deaths hidden, quiet, and complete. One of the most famous victims was Vercingetorix, the Gallic leader who once united tribes across Gaul against Julius Caesar. After his defeat, he spent years in captivity, held alive only until Caesar's triumph was ready. When he was finally paraded through Rome, he no longer resembled the warrior who had challenged an empire. Once the procession ended, he was taken to the Mamertine prison and executed. Another ruler met an even slower end. Jugurtha, king of Numidia, was lowered into the lower chamber after Marius's triumph. Ancient writers describe him losing his grip on reality as hunger and cold set in. He died after several days, his suffering unseen by the crowds celebrating above. The same pattern followed later rebellions. Simon Bar Giora, a leader of the Jewish revolt, was displayed in Rome after the destruction of Jerusalem. The parade paused while messengers waited for confirmation that he had been killed. Only after his execution did the ceremony continue. Not every ruler was executed. Some were spared because their survival served Roman interests better than their death. Living captives could be displayed as symbols of submission or used in future negotiations. But for those marked for death, the triumph was a cruel delay, a final exposure before disappearance. What happened after the parades reveals the true function of Roman power. Law protected citizens. Outside that boundary, conquest erased dignity. Queens, kings, and generals were reduced to objects used until their suffering had fully served Rome's purpose. The stone walls of the Mamertine prison still stand today. They remain a reminder that behind Rome's grand victories lay a system that turned human lives into warnings and humiliation into policy. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.